used to believe that there was very little that the American government would ever do in somewhat normal circumstances that would make the majority of people's lives that much better or worse, at least compared to what we could do as individuals for ourselves to improve our own lives. For example, the U.S. government could make healthcare much cheaper so that it would be easier for people to remain healthier, or maybe "and" is the right word here, Americans could actually start exercising and eating right. That second option would probably have far more of a positive impact on the overall healthcare system as a whole than anything that the government could actually do for us. But one of those two things requires a personal responsibility by us, the American people as a whole, and let's be honest, a lot of us are just way too lazy to do anything about that. It's much easier to complain and blame somebody else than it is to actually get off your butt and do something about your own problems. Let's look at another example. Income disparity. We could complain about how crappy people's working wages are, their living wages, or we could personally invest our own time and effort into developing the skills as individuals that it actually requires to make more money. But again, that requires responsibility by the individual. And how about the rising cost of housing? And that's a serious problem in some places. We could complain about how much it costs to buy a home and say we'll never get there. Or we could make a big life sacrifice, just like people have done throughout all of history, in order to improve their own lives. And we could migrate, we could move to where housing prices are much more affordable and go to a place where we could get ahead far more easily. These places do exist. I've noticed that when I point these types of things out in conversations, full-grown adults seem to do the intellectual equivalent of stomping their feet, sticking their fingers in their ears, and they just kind of start screaming, "I don't want to do that," just like a child. I've always thought that people could have a much better life if they just take matters into their own hands and make it happen. I used to have a group of friends where we just kind of had this motto. If one of us would get too whiny and start having a pity party for ourselves, another would step up and say, "Quit your bitching and do something about it." Some girl broke your heart? Go get another one. There's like an unlimited supply of women out there. There's like billions of them. If you don't like your living situation, go live somewhere else. If you don't like your job, apply for a different one. Our mentality was that there were no excuses as young, capable adults for our lives not to be as awesome as we wanted them to be. This illusion that so many people have where they think that someone else could have the sort of power that could hold the rest of us down was considered by us to be ridiculous at the time. And we wanted to remind each other to get out of our own way anytime we started to become our own worst enemies. That mentality that I had, that theory that we had, I carried that with me throughout adulthood, but it eventually took a beating in the year 2020. And I was forced to reevaluate my thinking. Suddenly it became obvious that our government was becoming this overreaching, tyrannical monster who sought to destroy small businesses. They ruined people's physical and mental well-being, and they just seemed to start diving deeper and deeper down the path of political corruption, all of which started affecting the average American's daily life in ways that we had actually never seen before. At least not in my lifetime. Not this blatantly. I mean, when was the last time that the government made decisions like this, which affected the average American's life so drastically? Maybe the draft in Vietnam? I don't know. I don't remember it in my lifetime. Our government systematically began to attempt to take individual sovereignty away from those who were once independently reliant, and it pushed Americans in a direction which would require the average person to need more help from those in positions of authority. The most blatant example of this, I think, was just physical exercise. Being in great physical shape was one of the best ways to prevent death from COVID. And yet the government forced gyms and fitness centers to close during the early days of the pandemic. In a so-called attempt at looking after our health, the government actually made us more unhealthy. And they forced us to go inside and stay there for 2 years, causing so many people to gain weight, get depressed, and maybe even become suicidal. Vitamin D deficiency was another huge factor in keeping people healthy during COVID. And what did the government do? They inexplicably closed public parks, the very place where you could go out to get healthy and bask in the sunshine. It didn't make any sense. Small businesses were ruined across the United States by these mandated government shutdowns. But the mega corporations, they were allowed to stay open. You couldn't get a croissant from the local bakery, but you could still go and get booze from the liquor store. Many of these entrepreneurs who created these ventures worked their entire lives at pursuing their dreams, just to have everything wiped out by the government in one fell swoop, whatever that means. What is a fell swoop? And what's mind-boggling is half of the American population seem to be thrilled by all of this because for some sick reason, the thought of forcing people to suckle on the teat of the American government seems to be some big, giant, wet dream come true for these people. I don't get it. Half of the population seems to want more government. Like more inefficient bureaucracy and problem solving? Is that what they want? Why? Why would anybody want that? Why on earth would anyone want the world to be run more like the DMV? Everyone hates going to the DMV. It makes people angry to have to be there. But why aren't people more angry with our government and our media about the way that they've behaved and basically gaslit us for the past 3 years? Is the thought that all of these measures that we took during COVID, that they were ultimately for the greater good of society? Is that still the mentality? Because if it is, then you kind of have to ask, was it really actually better? Were those methods better? By the end of the pandemic, Americans aged 65 and older made up like 92% of all deaths from the virus. And yet, the rest of society was still being kept down and punished. You know how millennials are angry with boomers for supposedly ruining their world? Well, now imagine how the children of millennials will feel when they grow up and realize that they were robbed of 2 years of their childhood for no good reason. I'm already starting to see people complain about it. This is going to be a very screwed up generation. They couldn't go to school, they couldn't go to birthday parties, they couldn't hang out with their friends. Many of them have become depressed internet addicts. Good job, liberals. Way to sacrifice the well-being of the children for what your cult considers the greater good of society. Just like how your generation hates boomers, I can't wait until the day when these kids, these teenagers, these young adults grow up and realize how much your generation screwed theirs over. All because you were clinging to this dying tribal narrative at a time when the statistics clearly show that your children were at very little risk of being greatly affected by COVID. These people's children are probably going to hate their parents' guts for what was done to them, and I would say deservedly so. And let's talk about adults. President Joe Biden wanted to get tens of millions of working Americans fired from their job towards the end of the pandemic for not getting vaccinated. And this was at a point in time when we found out that the vaccines didn't really actually work in the manner which we were originally told that they would. These tens of millions of Americans that Biden wanted to get fired were guilty of the following two things. One, they wanted to work. And two, they did not wish to be injected with an unproven vaccine which had not been properly tested yet. This, at least in my mind, was probably the most evil, most disgusting thing that I have ever seen an American president attempt to do to his own people. And yet, it seems like society just kind of forgot about the fact that he tried to do that. By contrast, many people talked about former President Donald Trump as if he was some kind of authoritarian. I mean, Trump isn't my favorite person ever, and I could probably think of 100 other people I'd rather have as president. But Trump never unconstitutionally threatened to ruin the livelihoods of tens of millions of Americans because he couldn't get them to do what he wanted them to do. But Joe Biden did try to do that. Which of these two people's actions seems more like those of an authoritarian? To me, the answer is obvious. Yes, Trump is an ass, but Biden is just pure evil. And only one of those two people's actions were those of an authoritarian in a way which would have directly affected the livelihood of this huge percentage of hardworking Americans who had done absolutely nothing wrong. In this specific scenario, thank God for the Supreme Court, who ruled that attempting to do this was considered unconstitutional. I have a question for liberals out there who voted for Joe Biden. Did you support his vaccine mandates? Did you also want to get tens of millions of people fired from their jobs for not doing what you wanted them to do? Did you want to get those of us who were considered essential workers, those of us who risked our lives in the early days of the pandemic while you were hunkering down in your work from home position, your safe spaces? Did you also support getting tens of millions of Americans fired from their job? Did you and do you still support the cause in hindsight? Because if you do, then fuck you. Am I angry? Yeah, I am. You bet I am. And for very good reason. To be completely honest, at the beginning of the pandemic, in the first few weeks, possibly even months, I fell for the narrative too at a time when it seemed like we really didn't know what we were dealing with quite yet. I remember at the time hearing this conservative talk show host compare life during COVID to life during wartime in Israel, where people just eventually learned to deal with the risk of going outside under the threat of constant shelling from above, and it will eventually just become a way of life, and that we too just need to throw caution to the wind and just learn to accept the risks. When I heard that, I remember thinking about how irresponsible of a thing that was for him to say. But in hindsight, ultimately, I understand that he was actually right and that I was wrong. We absolutely should have been more defiant from the beginning. I still have this photo of myself wearing a mask in the early days of COVID. Outside, at a park. When I shared the photos online, someone actually texted me and asked me, "Why are you wearing a mask at a park?" That person was absolutely right to ask that question. Why was I wearing a mask in a park? Outside in the sunshine. I wasn't really even very afraid of COVID by that point. But I guess that I thought I was just trying to make the people around me feel safer, I guess. At the time, I thought that I was being wisely cautious, yet simultaneously brave and defiant, because I was going out with others at a time when other people were just kind of locking themselves inside. But even in my so-called defiance, I was going against logic by wearing a mask outdoors and perpetuating this false premise which had been handed down to us by our incompetent, lying government. And even in spite of my lack of personal concern for the virus and how it would affect me, I allowed myself to virtue signal to others that I was going to be compliant to the narrative, even though if I dug down deep enough, I really didn't believe what I was doing was completely necessary. I was only doing what I thought other people expected of me because I was worried about the weight of the judgment of society coming down upon me if I didn't. I did something in that moment which I am opposed to at my core. I was virtue signaling to others that I too could become compliant. I'm disappointed in myself now that I have the benefit of hindsight at my disposal. I can still see those online comments that I made at the beginning of the pandemic about how cautious we should be. I still have podcast episodes out there from previous podcasts where I wasn't exactly defiant against many of the initial extreme precautions against COVID in those early weeks or months of the pandemic. I remember being one of those people who said, "We'll just have to hunker down and get through these next few weeks." Then weeks turned into months, and months turned into years. And the individual freedoms that we gave up during that time turned into this opportunity for a power grab by the American government, and they began to ruin the lives of so many people that they claimed to serve, under the premise that they were helping to rescue the lives of others by sacrificing themselves. Congratulations, you've been chosen as one of the people whose life gets ruined so that others can be saved. What an honor, right? I look back at that time in my life and the manner in which I was thinking at the time, and it's really kind of embarrassing in hindsight because I now understand that I was a small part of that bigger problem. And it would be so easy for me to just delete those comments and those podcast episodes and take down that photo that I took in the park with the mask on and pretend like it never happened. But I actually think that it's much better to be reminded of how I was once duped by a narrative for a short amount of time. and that I helped to perpetuate the idiocy. And that, yes, even I, as a somewhat skeptical person myself, am perfectly capable of falling for narratives too. Honestly, I'm a bit ashamed that I acted that way, and for a brief moment in time, I wasn't as personally defiant against tyranny as I should have been. And that lack of defiance by the people in general had serious, very, very serious consequences. Not only was I not defiant against tyranny, but I didn't even recognize it when I first saw it. But to be fair to myself, I did adjust somewhat quickly, and I eventually found myself siding with common sense and against idiocy and censorship. It probably took a few weeks or maybe even months, but it quickly became evident to me that we were being lied to by an extremely incompetent government. And for those of you who didn't adjust to the actual realities, and you kept clinging to the ridiculous narrative long after it was becoming more and more evident that there were huge holes in the arguments, I have to imagine that you probably feel even more embarrassed than I do, right? Unless you're still unwilling to admit it, which I think some people are. If you are still clinging 100% wholeheartedly to that narrative all these years later, 3 years later, I don't know what to tell you. You might just be a complete idiot. And let me be perfectly clear here. Yes, the coronavirus was a serious, dangerous, horrible thing that, at least in part, caused the deaths of millions of people around the world. And I had multiple friends who completely dropped out of society for a while because they were very close to family members who were extremely immunocompromised, and they didn't want to be the reason why their loved ones got sick or died. In that situation, it made perfectly good sense for those who were really close to the elderly or lived with the elderly or constantly were in contact with those who were susceptible to the virus. But why did we force healthy people who only hung out with other healthy people to stay home? Why get tens of millions of healthy people fired from their jobs for not complying with authoritarian decisions that were based upon shit science narratives? Most of us realized at some point or another during the pandemic that a lot of these policies made no sense whatsoever. Why force children to stay home and get fat and get depressed and lose all those years that they'll never get back? For those of you who eventually came to the conclusion that yes, these policies that the government was implementing were horrible, are you embarrassed too? Or are you also willing to admit that you were wrong? Or are you so proud and so aligned with your political ideologies that you are still unwilling to admit that you were guilty of perpetuating horrible narratives and supporting tyrannical government? If you are unwilling to admit these things, why? For those of you who saw COVID as an opportunity to go on a witch hunt, I think you should apologize to the people who you treated so badly back then. You should admit that you were kind of a horrible person. Those people that you ridiculed for being defiant against the media and against the government narratives. I have to imagine that looking back, if you're a somewhat intelligent person yourself, you have to be able to see where you went wrong, right? And many of you acted horribly towards those who ultimately turned out to be right. So the pandemic is over and we've all gone back to our normal lives, right? So why am I still so angry with people? I can never see the world in the same way again. I now know how deeply rooted tribalism is in human nature and how easily even the most extremely intelligent people can be warped and misled by those entities who wish to manipulate the masses. Have we learned our lessons, or will we fall for it again the next time too, when tyranny eventually shows up wearing a different costume? Or for some of you, are you still clinging to the narrative because you can't stand to admit that you were wrong about so very many things? Imagine coming to the conclusion that you once perpetuated evil and you just don't want to admit to it because, I don't know, because of your pride, I guess. In late 2019 and early 2020, I was looking to settle down and buy a home in the city that I lived in at the time, just to watch that city be destroyed by riots and government shutdowns. In the span of 6 months, I went from being a person who wanted to plant my roots in that community to becoming a person who couldn't escape from that place fast enough. I now have this overwhelming desire to be indefinitely nomadic. This experience of enduring the pandemic and seeing the way people acted has planted the seed of fear within me, where I now know how awful tribes can act when they gather together around a narrative. And I personally find it better to just be mobile, just in case history repeats itself and I feel the need to escape again. I don't want to become part of a community anymore. The other day I heard someone on the radio say the pandemic is over and the world is back to normal. But are you? Are you the same person that you were 4 years ago? Are you less trusting? Are you more bitter? Are you more skeptical of people's ulterior motives? You should probably be all of those things. I personally find myself moving to more and more conservative places, conservative states, and it's not because I like to cling to conservative ideologies, but because I am attempting to escape from nonsensical progressive thinking, because liberals and progressives were part of that same tribe which insisted upon enabling government tyranny when the shit hit the fan. And conservatives were the ones who stood up and said no. After 4 years of liberal people complaining about what they considered to be authoritarianism, these same people stood by silently as actual tyranny swept through the land. And I'm not the only one who was trying to escape from progressive ideologies. There was literally this thing called the Great Migration of 2020, which continues to this day, where conservative states became flooded with people who were escaping from the disastrous fallout created by the policies of incompetent liberal governments which they helped to put in power. And now that those people escaped from those horrible progressive places, they haven't learned their lesson. They wish to change the conservative places which they are invading and turn them into the same type of liberal shitholes which they escaped from. Progressive ideologies are mindlessly spreading like a horrible virus, and we should be equally afraid of that virus as we were the one in 2020. Maybe even more so. It's a pandemic in its own right, which seems to have horrible, horrible consequences of its own. And for those of us who once believed that we ultimately had autonomy over our own lives, and that the government would never overreach and try to destroy us, we have to let go of that old reality. The old reality is gone, if it ever even truly existed. And now we are forced to start over and rethink our lives in this new reality, in this new place, in this new America. And as Americans, we have to admit that we now live in a country governed by extreme corruption, just like in a third world country, where elections are unapologetically influenced by the media and by the government, by the establishment government. At the same time that that's going on, we simultaneously have to start learning how to constantly evade the new mental virus of extremist progressive ideologies, which seems to destroy every place it spreads to. And there is no mask for that. There is no vaccine. You've been listening to The Great Beginner Galactic. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks for listening to the show. The Great Beginner Galactic can be heard on Spreaker, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, Apple iTunes, and anywhere else that podcasts can be heard. If social media is your thing, you can follow the program on Facebook or Twitter. If you enjoy the show, upvote, share, like, and subscribe. Whenever and wherever those things can be done. If you'd like to send feedback, the easiest way to do that is to email the show at tgbiuniverse@gmail.com. TGBI as in the Great Big Intergalactic. Or you can leave a voicemail at 216-200-7940. Contributions could include written feedback, audio submissions, voicemails, or potentially even live guests. It was great having you today, and see you next time.